Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm Scott Bullingham, founder of the Twin Bill. Yesterday, Pete Rose turned 83. I can remember the very first time I saw Pete. He was at my local mall signing autographs, and I remember thinking, this guy with the terrible haircut over there, that guy has more hits than anyone in baseball history? He's fallen so far from baseball greatness that my fantasy league had him record a cameo message for the team with the worst record one year. Keith O'Brien's new book does a really incredible job of helping you remember what made Pete so great in the first place that led to the downfall that we're all so familiar with. His story is really the story of us. He has this very sort of Gatsby quality. And with the Ohtani allegations, Pete Rose and the book are exceptionally relevant. I chatted with Keith O'Brien about his new book, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose. The interview was recorded before federal charges were brought against Ohtani's interpreter. This is certainly not the last we'll hear of gambling issues with baseball. Enjoy. Keith, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Scott. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Great to have you. So look, there's been a lot of books about Pete Rose, written by him, about him. Why did you decide to write this book? What were you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, two reasons. Number one, I feel like previous books about Pete Rose have focused on the baseball part of it. And I want to be clear, baseball is a huge part of the story. But I always looked at this through the prism of him being a human and wanted to tell the story of an ordinary man from an ordinary background of ordinary talents and athleticism who scratched and clawed his way to the top. And then, in large part because of his own decisions and his own choices, loses it all. And so that is, to me, not a baseball story. It's a human story. It's really, frankly, a Greek tragedy that just happened to play out in and around a baseball field. So that was number one. I wanted to get access to tell that kind of story. And two, I wanted to revisit this story because the world, frankly, has changed. And it's changed in the 35 years since Pete Rose was banned. It's changed a lot in the last 5 or 6 years with the sweeping legalization of sports gambling in America. And, as everybody knows, it is still not allowed and not permissible and against the rules of Major League Baseball for any player to place wagers on a game in which he is involved in. So if Pete Rose were to commit these crimes today, he'd face similar punishment. However, there is cosmic irony to the changes that have happened, and of course, we have seen that irony play out in recent weeks.
So you were actually able to talk to Pete, correct?
I was, yes.
What did you gain from that experience? What were your impressions from talking from him?
Well, the first thing is gathered something from those interviews and those in-person meetings that I wouldn't have been able to have if I had never gotten the access. And that is Pete does have a charisma to him. I think that's important because in many ways Pete Rose has become a caricature of himself in recent years as he has made mistake after mistake after mistake. And he has earned whatever reputation he has. But when you sit with him in his presence and he's talking to you, he has a thing and a charisma that, frankly, I have personally only ever found before in other very famous politicians and actors. And the reason why I mention that, Scott, is that, in the interviews I would subsequently do, and I did more than 160 hours of interviews with people who were in Pete Rose's orbit. Time and again, people I was interviewing about Pete Rose broke down and became emotional when talking about the past. And like you, I've been privileged to interview lots of people over the years, thousands of people. And of course, at times those interviews can be emotional, but it's typically when you're dealing with say a real tragedy, a death or something like that. And in this case, we're talking about a ball player. We're talking about a guy who had addictions because that's what he had. We're talking about a guy who blew up his life and blew up lots of other people's lives with it. And in those interviews, these people would become emotional, and and I understood that. because I had also been in Pete's presence and sort of have felt what it was like to have his attention. And the other thing I'll say is this: when I interviewed Pete in person, it was over 3 days, and I went to Las Vegas, where he lives today, to do those interviews. And I did not do the interviews at his condo. We didn't do it in the quiet of his living room. Every day he would pick me up at my hotel and we would go to one of his favorite restaurants. And, when we sat in the restaurants, people, of course, would drift by the table to say hello and ask for an autograph or whatever. But oftentimes they just stopped at the table to just say hello. And again, on multiple occasions, people became emotional and began to cry just trying to talk to Pete Rose. And, and it sounds crazy, right? Because this is a guy who's made all of these mistakes, and has been rightly pilloried for those mistakes. And yet, when an everyday average person sees him, sometimes they too become emotional. And finally asked Pete about it when it happened, and I said, "What is that?" I'd seen it now a couple of times, and I said, "What is that? What's going on there? How do you explain that?" And Pete said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." He said it's typically men, and it's typically men of a certain age, men, around his age or a little younger. And he said, I think I remind them of their fathers. I think I remind them of themselves as boys going to a ball game with their dads. And Pete Rose is notoriously not very good at self-reflection, uh, but I actually think he nailed that one.
Well, so he also was picking where these interviews were held. Does he enjoy having these reactions from these people? Is this a thing that keeps him going, you thought?
I think, like a lot of famous people, he appreciates still the adoration and the attention that he
Sure.
he receives today. When it happened, Pete would sometimes try to make the moment less awkward. He would try to fill the silence by making small talk or just keep talking while the person tried to gather themselves. Uh, Pete Rose has met millions of people over the years, millions in person, shaking their hands, signed a baseball for them. Many of those people, of course, have paid for that interaction, at times a lot of money for that interaction. You know, Again, while I still did have access to Pete Rose, and lately I have not, he has stopped calling me back. But when I did have the access, I went with him on a couple of occasions to these events in public, and saw the interactions with the crowd, and yeah, people are spending 50, 60, 80, $100 or more for whatever they want to have signed. But nobody I met in those lines, and there were lines, nobody I met in those lines felt any kind of remorse about whatever they were paying for that moment.
So I was born in '86. I grew up in the '90s. So I kind of missed Pete Rose. He was always the bad guy in my life. I never saw the good aspects of his career. For someone like me, how would you describe the greatness of Pete Rose, the player?
Well, of course, we have the persona of Charlie Hustle. This desire to play harder, work harder, run harder, slide harder than the next guy. And one thing I wanted to do with my book was try to unpack that a little bit, because I do think it is a persona. But I learned two things in my research, and by research I mean interviews, going back and looking at raw footage of games and interviews in the 1960s and 70s, and talking to lots of people about it, and about this persona of hustle. I can say two things. The first is it was 100% real. And we wouldn't even know what to do with someone like Pete Rose today, someone who played as hard as Pete Rose today, because they hardly knew what to do with him in the 1960s and 70s. In 1963, when he was given this nickname, which was intended to be an insult, Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford saw him playing so hard, and they were mocking him, saying, like, "Who's this Charlie Hustle over here?" People on the field, his own teammates with the Cincinnati Reds and his opponents, didn't understand what he was doing and, and why he had to sprint to first base, why he had to slide head first, which very few players did at that time. It strikes me that, this is a time when every player, including Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford, were playing for the next year's contract. Nobody had multi year deals. Nobody. Everybody used their stats from their current year to win a better contract in the next year. So at a time when on paper, every guy had to play hard. They still didn't understand why he was doing what he was doing. They thought he was showing them up. They thought he was a showboat. It didn't help that Pete was incredibly arrogant and loved to talk about himself after the games. In the clubhouse, in the locker rooms, on the roads, making friends with the reporters. And that's the second piece that's so important. He did make friends with reporters. Pete did, and one reason why he won the friendships of baseball writers was because he was so accessible. Reporters would say later that they ever ran out of story ideas, they would go to Pete Rose's locker because Pete would talk to them and he would give them stories. He would just serve them up. So that's one real reason why reporters liked him. But the second one, I think, is a bit more subtle. Pete was white and working class. Those two things are important because in the time when Pete came up as a ball player, baseball was really beginning to change. It was transforming from an entirely white sport to a much more diverse sport. And by the early 1970s, the biggest stars in baseball were typically Latino players and black players. Pete was almost now like a throwback, and that mattered to a certain segment of fans. And I do think it mattered to the reporters too, because the reporters were all male. Until 1979, not a single woman was allowed in a major league locker room. 1979. The reporters were also almost entirely white. And so you have a white working class male press corps covering the sport. Inevitably, even from biases they may not even understand, they're drifting to the locker of a man who looks like them and talks like them and came from a neighborhood like theirs. They're drifting to Pete Rose, and so in a great many ways, the press corps really did inflate and gild the mythology of Charlie Hustle, and tell us a story that we all wanted to hear.
So I want to move ahead a little bit. One of the defining moments in Rose's career that you hear a lot about it's the Ray Fosse collision, and I think has become a little bit of a touchstone for how people view Pete Rose. What was the reaction at the time?
So this is the play in July 1970. Pete Rose is playing for the National League All-Star team. Ray Fosse, a young catcher for the Cleveland Indians, who had been drafted in front of Johnny Bench a few years earlier and was predicted to be the Johnny Bench of the American League, is the catcher for the American League. And in the 12th inning, when Pete's on second base in a tie game, in a sold out stadium in Cincinnati, in a game that's being televised nationally and being watched, by the way, by 50 million people, Rose barrels home. And when he sees that Ray Fosse is blocking the plate, instead of trying to slide around him or go under him, he tries to go through him. And I really did a ton of reporting around this moment because this, to me, is the moment when Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose. And in fact, there's a snapshot of the collision, or the aftermath of the collision, rather, in my book, Charlie Hustle. And I love that snapshot because it's almost like that's the moment that Pete Rose becomes the player that we think of today. And nobody would ever play like that in an all-star game today. And that's been true for at least 30 years, right? And so, you know, in the last 30 years or so, when people think about this moment where Pete barrels into Ray Fosse, injures him, breaks his shoulder in a way that isn't learned until much later, forever alters Ray Fosse's career, frankly, shortens his career, I believe, based on my reporting. We now think of it must be a character flaw. Who would play like that? That's insane. Who would do that? And to be clear, in July 1970, that night, there were some people who were also upset. In particular, Frank Robinson, the future Hall of Famer, Pete's former teammate with the Reds, who was now on the Orioles, and it was in the American League clubhouse after the game. Frank Robinson turns to Ray Fosse as Ray is trying to get his uniform off over his injured shoulder, and he says, could have Pete slid around you? And Ray said, yeah, I think so. And Robbie was upset about that, and thought that was uncalled for. However, that same night, many future Hall of Famers, including the managers of both clubs, and including the third base coach who waved Pete Rose home, Leo DeRocher, all of them believed that Pete Rose had done the right thing. And so there is a difference of opinion in the moment. And it's only later that we look back on it in modern times and say there has to be something wrong with a man who would play that hard.
I'm going to jump ahead even more because we have a lot to talk about here. So obviously the Ohtani investigation, we're in the thick of it right now. From what you've researched, and you did a ton of research on the investigation for Rose, what's important for us to be paying attention to here?
Well, the important thing to note right off the top is, there are some significant historical parallels here between what happened in 1989 and what has been happening today. Uh, Starting with this, Pete Rose doesn't get in trouble in 1989 for placing bets a couple weeks earlier. Pete Rose gets in trouble in 1989 for things that happened a few years earlier, and these were bets that were being placed with bookies in Ohio and elsewhere. And the other important parallel here is initially it wasn't Pete Rose who was getting in trouble. It was men in his inner circle. These were not interpreters. These were his pals, guys who would do his bidding. And one of the things these guys did was they placed his bets on sports, initially on football and basketball, but soon, by 1986, they were placing the bets on baseball. And it was these men, not Pete Rose, who popped up onto the radar of federal investigators, specifically the FBI in Cincinnati. And one by one, the men in Pete's inner circle start to get picked off. They're put under surveillance. They're questioned. One begins to turn on another. And then who gets wind of these things happening? The press. So the same kind of things, allegedly have happened in recent weeks. You've got alleged payments being made to an alleged illegal bookmaker in Southern California. We have an alleged involvement, Shohei Ohtani's inner circle, specifically his interpreter. And we have a federal investigation, and we have reporters digging in. All of these things sound incredibly familiar to me. And, the other thing I think that it's important to note is it wasn't like Major League Baseball received word of Pete's rumors of gambling and it was settled and solved in a matter of 24 hours or even a week. Even when they got the early reports, and even when Major League Baseball went and hired a special counsel, an independent counsel, to dig up the truth, it would take 7 more months for this to be settled in any meaningful way. And so, while this story involving Shohei Ohtani and his interpreter still remains a developing story and a story with many murky details, I think it's reasonable to think that we know everything right now or that this will just go away.
Looking at the way that Pete handled the investigation, w- what should the Otani camp be doing differently than how Pete handled it?
Pete's biggest mistake is the classic mistake. Not a mistake made by baseball players, but again, a mistake made by humans. Pete lied. He evaded, he obfuscated, he did everything he could to try to slip away. And I talked to Pete about that in the time again when I had access to him and he was still talking to me. I asked him why. Why would you do that? And his answer was that he still thought he could get away with it. Hubris, in other words. And then even later, as it becomes readily apparent to anyone that Major League Baseball now doesn't just have rumors, they have the goods on him. They have bank records and phone records and depositions from people who reportedly have firsthand, eyewitness testimony of Pete's bets on baseball. Even when all that happens, and it's clear that the right decision is to tell the truth. Pete doesn't. And I asked him why. And he said simply that at that point, he was fighting for his life. He was fighting for his livelihood. And in Pete's mind, he was at war. This was it was like a baseball game for him. He had to win in the way he knew how to win. But my reporting shows that if Pete had been honest, in February 1989 or in the several weeks after that, in the early weeks of this investigation, the whole narrative is different. And I don't mean to suggest that he would have, gotten off without a punishment. I do believe there would have been a punishment. But I don't think it would have been the kind of punishment that we're still wrestling with 35 years later. And I think that is without question uh, an important lesson from this investigation, not just for whatever current investigations Major League Baseball is doing now, but probably just a good lesson for life.
I want to talk about the Hall of Fame. I grew up in the '90s with the steroids guys. I think they should all be in. You can't. I feel like you can't ignore my experience with baseball. That was my era. There is this sort of almost, I hate to use the word cancel culture around the Hall of Fame now, where we are trying to pick and choose who and why and for what reason. This question, obviously, you deal with a lot. How do you view the Hall of Fame? How does Pete view the Hall of Fame now? I don't think he's getting in his lifetime. I think that's pretty set. Where does this all fall in the realm of Pete Rose right now?
So, in my book Charlie Hustle, I specifically don't take sides on this. I'm not trying to sway anyone's opinion on this matter or, frankly, any other matter. I tried to look at Pete Rose's story through the prism of history, tell that story, let people come to their own conclusions, about the Hall of Fame and anything else. But of course, I have thought a lot about Pete and the Hall of Fame, and I've thought a lot too about, how we do honor athletes in this country. And my prevailing thought on it is this: I think we have completely lost perspective here. We put our athletes on pedestals that they often did not ask for, and we ascribe to them moral values that they may or may not have. The fact is, we just don't know much about them. We just don't. And the Shohei Otani story of late shows that yet again. No one would have ever imagined just a few weeks ago that a gambling scandal involving a reported millions of dollars would be on the edges of the universe of the world's biggest baseball star. No one knew that. We don't know what we don't know about these guys, all of them. And so for that reason, in a blanket way, I believe that players should be enshrined in our athletic halls of fame or not, based on what they did on the field, on the field, between the lines. And and so in that way, I would agree with you in a blanket way, Scott. Whether it's Pete Rose or baseball's other ne'er do wells, and there are many of them, the Barry Bondses and Roger Clemens and Alex Rodriguez's, and those who have, in our opinions, violated something about the game. I believe they should be enshrined in the Hall of Fame if they earned it on the field. And then if their crimes against the game or their mistakes in life are so egregious, I think we should put them on the plaque. Put those mistakes and crimes on the plaque at Cooperstown. Uh, Put them there right next to their accomplishments for perpetuity.
That was Keith O'Brien, author of Charlie Hustle. To close us out, we have Jack Albert reading his poem Bart from our latest issue.
My poem is called Bart. It's about the great literary scholar Dr. Bartlett Giamatti, who was a huge fan of the game. Bart. He chain-smoked his way throughout every lecture while pitching the essence of the Divine Comedy. From the depths of purgatory to the green fields of summer, he juxtaposed literary images with baseball analogies. No surprise when the professor was named commissioner, giving the game ultimate class and stature. Dr. Giamatti, most fluent and learned fan. And when Pistol was caught gambling on his team, Bart stood tall defending the honor code, reminding us all of the grand unwritten rule. I'll always remember the cigarettes dangling from his sturdy hand, one after another, until the lecture ended. Only 5 months on the job, age 51. Bart went to bat for the soul of the game, puffing away into baseball heaven.
Thanks for listening. You can support the Lit Mag and the podcast on Patreon. Until next time,